In Ukraine, foreign support has always played a major role, but it's also always stopped short of certain red lines. Both Russia and Ukraine have received arms shipments from allies, and both have recruited foreigners to serve in their militaries, be that in the regular Russian military, PMCs like Wagner, or Ukraine's International Legion. But despite Ukraine requesting at least some direct foreign military intervention from day one, to this point Ukraine's allies and supporters have always stopped short of sending in regular combat units or taking kinetic action on Ukrainian soil. Now, though, it appears that one country out there has decided to cross that particular policy Rubicon and send in the troops. And in a turn of events that probably wasn't on anyone's bingo card back in March 2022, the first ones into the fray aren't the US Air Force or the Poles or even the French, who've teased the concept in the past. Instead, it looks like this first direct foreign commitment is going to be supporting Russia, not Ukraine, and it's going to come from North Korea. And while there's still immense uncertainty and a lot of questions to ask, I think that's entirely natural when we're talking about Korean troops potentially fighting a ground war in Eastern Europe, today I thought it was time to discuss what we think we know about North Korea's troop deployment to Russia, how it fits into the context of the wider war, what it might mean, and critically, what might happen now that a country has broken the taboo on direct military deployments. To do that, I'm first going to try and put this move by North Korea into context, looking at the way the course of the war in Ukraine has shifted since the last time we looked at it, the race by both sides to regenerate through the immense cost of that fighting, and the immensely important role North Korea appears to have played in sustaining Russia's offensive potential. Then I'll pivot to looking at the North Korean troops specifically, what we know or think we might know about the North Korean deployment, what it might mean for the war, and how Ukraine's various allies and supporters might respond. And I'll close with a look at one of the reasons why the responses we've seen so far may have been relatively muted, with a quick discussion of the upcoming US election and the role of the broader American alliance structure in shaping how various countries respond to the war in Ukraine going forward. But before we jump into it, I'd like to welcome back a returning sponsor. When you see a news headline, it can sometimes be difficult to know if critical information is being left out, or if you're seeing the story from all the angles. If you look at stories about North Korean troops being sent to Ukraine, for example, this one gives the context that an estimated 10,000 troops being sent would be a significant increase on the previous Pentagon estimate of 3,000, but the preview mostly talks about those troops being sent to Russia to train. Flip over to this article and you lose the 3,000 figure, but you find out the US expects those North Korean troops to do a lot more than train, transitioning to fighting within the next several weeks. The tool being used to quickly flip between headlines here is called Ground News. They provide a website and app that draw on more than 50,000 sources around the world so that you can quickly and conveniently see how given stories are being covered. They also provide extra information on the sources being drawn on, including ownership information and ratings on political lean and factuality, reportedly based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. Dig deeper and you'll also find some interesting tools like the blind spot feed. This explicitly tries to surface stories that are primarily being covered by the kinds of sources you might not ordinarily consume, which can be pretty illuminating if you're trying to understand how narratives are developing in different parts of the information space. I've long supported Ground News on the channel as a potentially useful tool, and if you don't already have it, now might be a particularly good time to get it. For a limited time, if you click the link in the description, you'll get access to a 50% discount on their Unlimited Access Vantage plan. So if you're interested, give the link a click, and with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. Okay, so if you're a country like Russia, calling in North Korean troops for assistance probably isn't your first preference. It's likely to bring a range of military, diplomatic and political complications, which we'll go into a little bit later on. So a good opening question, I think, is how is the situation on the Ukrainian battlefield shifting, and how might that link into the decision to bring in North Korean personnel? At an operational and strategic level, this is arguably a period of time where Russia has some pretty strong imperatives to go onto the offensive. On the military side, the Ukrainian mud season is rapidly approaching, but it isn't here yet. During that period, large tracts of Ukrainian territory are liable to become a kind of muddy slush. And if you're talking about dirt roads or fields that have been shelled into moonscape status and systemically stripped of vegetation, the vulnerability is sometimes going to be even greater. From a historical perspective, the main effects of the mud season, beyond just making everyone more miserable than they already were, include making offensive operations generally more difficult as they tend to bog down, literally and figuratively, complicating logistics and supply, especially when you don't have things like railways and hard surface roads in order to support those supply routes, and even diminishing the effect of some kinds of ordnance if they're not properly fused. So logically speaking, ahead of a mud season, you might want to go onto the offensive in order to secure better supply routes for your troops, problematise your opponent's supply routes, for example by taking key roads or even just an elevated position overlooking those roads, for example. You might be able to set yourself up for further success when the mud eventually does come and your opponent can no longer as easily supply their frontline positions by just paddock bashing or using temporary tracks. Plus, there might just be a general military imperative to make what gains you can before you get to the time of year where vehicles have a non-zero chance of drowning on land. Another side of the military imperative for Russia to go on the offensive at the moment might be simple opportunity. As pretty broadly predicted, we're at a stage of the war where a lot of Ukrainian forces are comparatively exhausted and their supply situation is under immense pressure. Right now, Russia is in a position of significant material advantage, so there might be an incentive for them to push the offensive while that remains the case. But beyond just that military calculus of war, there are probably some pretty strong political incentives in play in Moscow as well. With elections coming up soon in a range of countries, including the United States, and Ukraine currently in the process of trying to generate international support for its so-called victory plan, Moscow likely has significant incentives to try and demonstrate success, make the Ukrainian situation look as hopeless as possible, almost no matter the cost. Ultimately, we can't be entirely sure how these or other incentives are or aren't shaping Russian decision-making. But what we probably can say is that there are some pretty significant reasons for Russia to launch or intensify offensive operations in this period, and I think the evidence shows that so far, that's exactly what's happened. Over the last 2 months, it would probably be quicker to list areas of the front where Russia hasn't launched significant offensive operations than places where it has. In the zone of Ukraine's own little special military operation on Russian territory, in part by dedicating additional resources, the Russians appear to have pushed back many of the Ukrainian positions and averted a couple of key threats. They prevented Ukraine from taking the town of Koronevo and then pushed them back from the river, re-establishing a ground line of communication to the Glushkovo sub-region, a zone which it appeared for a while Ukraine was attempting to cut off from supply and force the Russians to withdraw from. In the region there appear to have been dueling attempts at tactical encirclements and significant positional battles, but at time of recording the area of Russian territory here, assessed to be under full Ukrainian control, has been reduced to just north of 600 square kilometres. This is also the region, reportedly, where North Korean troops may find themselves deployed. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, Russia was able to take a number of locations, including Volodar, an objective which had frustrated them for the better part of 2 years at this point. After multiple attempts to bash through Volodar, eventually the Russians were basically able to grasp their way around it, problematising the supply situation, turning the battle there in their favour, and setting the stage for some of the further advances we've seen. At Chasiv Yar, the town which became the next real defensive barrier in the area to the Russian advance after the fall of Bakhmut back in May 2023. As you can see on screen there, the last 2 months have featured some lightning Russian advances, meaning they've reportedly managed to get some troops across the canal and occupy a couple of blocks of houses there. Meanwhile, on the approaches towards Pokrovsk, the Russians have continued to grind forward, taking a number of smaller settlements and defensive positions, making it seem increasingly likely at this point that we will see a true Battle of Pokrovsk. The main purpose of this episode is not to comprehensively go through all of Russia's recent attack vectors. I'll save that for a future dedicated episode. But just that sample, I hope, is probably enough to give you a sense of the wider picture. At multiple points along the front, Russia is generally on the offensive, and over the last several months, they've also generally been taking Ukrainian territory at a faster rate than they were earlier in 2024. According to one report, since early August, Russia has taken about 1,140 square kilometres of Ukrainian territory, while Ukraine's taken about 614 kilometres of Russia. I don't think it's entirely certain yet how significant that trend will ultimately be. On one hand, it constitutes an acceleration of the rate of Russian advance. On the other hand, at a zoomed-out strategic scale, we are still well short of the rate of advance that Russia would need to sustain, month on month, in order to reach its stated territorial objectives, prior to the point where things like Vladimir Putin dying of old age and Ukraine deploying its first sixth-generation fighters become genuine possibilities. The Ukrainians probably have reasons for concern and are definitely feeling the pressure, but by historical standards, this is still a very slow-moving front. And I think the evidence available to us suggests at least two primary observations. Firstly, the Ukrainians are finding it very difficult to hold back some of these Russian offensive actions. And secondly, that Russia is having to expend a pretty prodigious amount of resources in order to maintain those offensives. We have seen claims from the Ukrainians and certain foreign intelligence services that Russian manpower losses have spiked significantly over the last couple of months. For reasons I've discussed in the past, though, I generally don't like to pay too much attention to claims around manpower losses because they're quite difficult to observe and verify. If we look at the data around visually confirmed equipment losses, though, it certainly seems like an awful lot of metal is being fed into the grinder. In 2023, about 74 Russian tanks and 134 AFEs in those categories I mentioned were being added to the list every month. When it peaked in Q2 this year, the tank number was closer to 128 per month, and the AFV figure was pushing dangerously close to the 250 mark. And while yes, if you look at that Q3 section of the chart, it might look like Russian losses began to slow towards the latter part of the year, that trend too recently appears to have started reversing. In August of this year, Russia suffered the visually confirmed loss of 61 main battle tanks and 184 AFVs in those categories we discussed. Notably, this correlated directly with the period where Ukraine chose to go onto the offensive and start taking territory in Russia proper. After August, though, things appear to have spiked again, up to 77 tanks and 280 AFVs in the most recent month of October. While there are always a range of limitations when it comes to data like this, it does seem notable that in September and October, things like BMPs, BTRs and MTLBs were being piled onto the list at a rate about 60% higher than the 2023 average. And while the Russian equipment loss rates have been shifting, we haven't actually seen that much change in the ratio of losses. While there have been some monthly spikes, usually correlated with periods where Ukraine has launched offensive operations like Zaporizhzhia in 2023 or Kursk in 2024, overall the loss rate for main battle tanks has remained relatively consistent at between 3.5 and 4.5 to 1, while the AFV loss rate actually appears to have shifted further in Ukraine's favour over time, from a bit over 3 to 1 in 2023 up to around 4 to 1 in September and October 2024. It's very important to understand the limitations and be cautious when you're dealing with data like this. I think this data picture is generally consistent with intense Russian offensive activity, but also a world where the Ukrainian military is able to make the price of that kind of offensive action very, very high. So in the context of these very intensive and very expensive Russian offensive actions, there's probably even more pressure on these militaries than normal to find the manpower, equipment and munitions they need to maintain and rebuild their strength, lest they break down under the pressure of the constant attrition. On the Ukrainian side, we've seen some future infusions of manpower, equipment and munitions enter the pipeline, even if most haven't arrived yet. On the manpower side, that includes a reported uptick in the Ukrainian mobilisation rate, as well as foreign commitments, like France, for example, saying they are going to train and equip another Ukrainian combat brigade. While on the equipment side, we've seen the usual mixture of a number of smaller commitments combined with the occasional larger one. We found out, for example, that Ukraine can expect to receive 49 former Australian Abrams main battle tanks in their M1A1 version, now that the Australian Army is transitioning over to its new M1A2 SEP V3s. Now, in the grand scale of this conflict, 49 tanks might not seem like a lot. But on the other hand, this is a single donation from one of Ukraine's smaller supporters, supplying 60% more Abrams than the Americans have been able to provide so far, and allowing the Ukrainians to resupply their units that are already using the Abrams, taking advantage of the training, logistics and support structures that are already in place. Another smaller donor that's been able to come up with some desperately needed kit is Croatia, who will reportedly be providing the Ukrainians 30 M84 main battle tanks, which is the former Yugoslav version of the Soviet T-72, and 30 M80 infantry fighting vehicles, which is basically what you get when Yugoslavia designs and builds a BMP. In exchange for providing those 60 armoured vehicles, Croatia will reportedly receive a discount on its purchase of new German Leopard 2A8s. Again, a far from war-changing contribution on its own, but a significant package for a country with a population of fewer than 4 million people. Perhaps the biggest recent announcement, though, was the White House informing the US Congress that it intended to provide Ukraine with about $5.55 billion worth of defence equipment and services under the Presidential Drawdown Authority. A cynic might suggest that this announcement was basically a product of political gridlock in the United States. Congress had previously authorised billions of dollars in Presidential Drawdown Authority, but a lot of that authorisation was due to expire on the 30th of September. Earlier, it seemed the White House simply planned on Congress extending the timeline for this authorisation so it can continue making announcements into 2025, but that approach may have become politically difficult. Ultimately, it appears the White House simply decided to use all of the authorisation 4 days before it expired, rather than allowing it to lapse. The key caveat here, of course, is that just because the drawdown's been announced, that doesn't mean it will be rapidly delivered. And especially given that future Ukraine aid packages are likely to have a somewhat complicated journey through the United States Congress, we may instead see this $5.5 billion spread over several months rather than dumped on the Ukrainian battlefield over a weekend. For its part, Russia is also significantly ramping up efforts to make sure its military has what it needs. When we last talked about the Russian economy, I pointed out that the Bank of Russia and several international institutions were proceeding on the assumption that Russian defence spending would start to fall in 2025 and 2026 compared to what they thought would be a 2024 high. This would presumably take some pressure off the overheating Russian economy and reflect a fall in military demands. You might recall me being a bit sceptical of the idea that defence spending would actually come down during a war, and now, according to draft Russian budget documents, it appears that defence spending is very much going in the other direction. To paraphrase one article, Russia is set to increase defence spending by 25% to a new post-Soviet record, bringing the official defence budget up to 13.5 trillion rubles in 2025, 3 trillion more than in 2024, and, quote, taken together, spending on defence and security will account for 40% of Russia's total government spending, with the main condolence for Ukraine being that so much of that spending is being sent inside Russia on internal security rather than prosecuting the war in Ukraine. Still, we should probably expect that anticipated increase in funding to manifest in maintained or expanded levels of Russian war production. One potential ongoing challenge Russia might have, though, is that while that level of defence spending, recruitment activity and military production might be sufficient to generate a degree of material advantage over Ukraine, when you compare it to what Ukraine is able to spend and what they receive from their various allies and supporters, it's not clear that gap is actually sufficient to enable Russia to achieve its goals before the country starts to run on empty. The Russian way of warfare in Ukraine has often been to leverage advantages in things like ammo supply and heavy equipment in order to slowly grind their way forward. But in doing so, it also tends to consume those resources much quicker than its Ukrainian opponent. If your plan for going forward requires you to outshoot your opponent 4-1, you're going to need 4 times as much ammo. And so given that tendency for the Russian military machine to hungry hippo its way through whatever resources are fed into it, you can start to see why even a country like Russia, with its enormous reserves of Soviet materiel and quite large population, might start to quite seriously look at potential sources for foreign assistance, including potentially additional troops from countries like North Korea. Before we start talking specifically about North Korea sending troops to Russia, though, I want to focus on some of the other ways in which Pyongyang appears to have been assisting Moscow, because while perhaps understandably a lot of the reporting is focused on the new and novel element, which is the North Korean troops, I don't want that to distract from some of the other very important moves that North Korea has made, namely by manoeuvring itself into position as the new arsenal of autocracy. We've already covered parts of how this new role and relationship evolved. The soft launch appears to have been some initial munition supply agreements between Pyongyang and Moscow, which we covered, followed by Putin and Kim hard launching their new bromance with the signature of the Russia-North Korea Partnership Treaty earlier this year, with the Russian Duma doing its part to elevate that relationship status to official by ratifying the Partnership Treaty on the 24th of October, just over a week ago at time of recording. That agreement provides a legal basis for military and technical cooperation, as well as mutual assistance. Now, to be fair, you could describe this relationship as one where both sides are arguably gold diggers in it for financial, material or security gain, with it being entirely possible that Pyongyang follows Tehran's favoured approach of taking the Russians to the cleaners during negotiations in exchange for their support. But leaving aside for a moment what they may have asked for in return, there's a lot of evidence available to us suggesting that North Korea has really stepped up its efforts to deliver vitally needed war material to Russia, particularly ammunition. Based on the available reporting and the satellite imagery we've seen make it into open source, the supply lines connecting the DPRK to Russia's front lines in Ukraine are obviously very long and appear to combine sea and rail transportation. The images you see on the right there, released by the Republic of Korea, appear to show Russian ships, the Angara on top and Lady R on the bottom, loading up cargo, reportedly weapons and munitions in a North Korean port, before heading back to Russia. Now, in many cases, these shipments do appear to have taken advantage of a cutting-edge counter-surveillance technology known as the shipping container, meaning we often can't see the physical shells in question during this shipment phase. At the same time, though, this might not be a mystery worthy of Sherlock Holmes or Jack Ryan. According to Russian data, trade with North Korea was absolutely minimal in 2021 and 2022. Then, coincidentally, after reports about munition supply agreements started to come out and the first North Korean munitions started appearing on the front line, they started reporting a significant uptick in that trade volume. For Russian import volumes from North Korea to be increasing, they have to be importing something, and there are precious few things that North Korea actually produces in surplus. And its reported top exports include counterfeiting, cybercrime, and apocalyptic nuclear threats. North Korea arguably just doesn't have that much to sell to Russia, besides weapons and people, and the people hopefully don't go in shipping containers. So for a range of reasons, including where a lot of these shipping containers appear to be eventually sent in Russia, think ammunition depots and arsenals for example, many researchers appear to be confident assuming that when we see these shipping containers going to Russia, they're probably full of munitions. The how is probably not the most interesting part here though, it's the what and how much. We've talked in the past about European efforts that ultimately fell behind schedule to get Ukraine at least 1 million artillery shells over the course of a year. And when we first talked about North Korea sending shells to Russia, we were using numbers in roughly that range. But since that North Korean supply effort kicked off, however, the estimates over how many rounds have been sent has continuously grown. In October 2023, it was reported that North Korea had delivered about 1,000 shipping containers worth of munitions to Russia. By February 2024, 6,700 containers. And by the beginning of this month, those estimates had reached 20,000 shipping containers. I'll attach some of the relevant reporting, but those shipments appear to have included RPG anti-tank rockets, KN-23 short-range ballistic missiles, Bullseye 4 anti-tank guided missiles, and a truly enormous number of artillery shells. Based on some assumptions around what you can safely fit into a shipping container, what proportion of them are likely to be running empty, and what other materials and equipment are likely to be in some of those containers rather than just more and more shells, one recent report came up with a very rough estimate of around 6 million artillery shells supplied, 4.5 million rounds of 152 and 1.5 million rounds of 122. South Korean intelligence has publicly released a somewhat higher estimate of more than 8 million rounds. And that's not accounting for all those other systems we just noted North Korea supplied. On the right there you can see debris from a KN-23 short-range ballistic missile. Based on one report, which I'll link in the description, Russia is believed to have received at least 2 shipments of these KN-23 and KN-24 ballistic missiles, one in the fall of 2023 and the second in summer 2024. And estimates for how many missiles were sent in those batches do vary. I've seen numbers as low as 60 and high as 100. And while that may not sound like a lot, you have to recall that might be equivalent to about a year of Iskander production at pre-war rates, and perhaps 2 months of Russian production at more recent rates. Sure, the accuracy, reliability, safety of Iskander may not always be there if you're substituting in a KN-23 instead, but when you're talking about a systems category that's proven particularly useful in Ukraine, like TBMs, a 10 to 20% increase in availability is certainly nothing to scoff at. There are also other munitions, as I mentioned, like MRL projectiles, ATGMs, but they don't really move the needle the way the artillery shells and ballistic missiles do, so let's focus on them and the broader picture. There are certain aspects of the war in Ukraine where no matter what North Korea does, Russia is always going to have a relative advantage or disadvantage. North Korean intervention can't, for example, invert the entire nature of the fight and take away the advantage Ukraine gets from being the defender. Nor does North Korea have anything to do with one area of Russia's fire superiority in Ukraine, which is its availability of glide bombs and aircraft to drop them. But in terms of the sheer amount of explosives being delivered, damage done and casualties inflicted, the artillery fight in Ukraine absolutely matters. Because Russia has fairly constantly had an advantage in the number of artillery shells it fires relative to the Ukrainians, it might be tempting to think of this aspect of the war as unchanging, impossible to influence. But I'd suggest the available data indicates the balance has actually swung pretty wildly over time, from times and places where Russia may have been firing more than 10 artillery shells for every 1 Ukraine fired in return, to niche cases where the situation got pretty close to parity, like the very beginning of Ukraine's mid-2023 offensive, while recently, according to the Ukrainian military, the ratio is closer to 2 to 2.5 to 1 in Russia's favour. And the advantage Russia has largely enjoyed in terms of shell and munition availability shouldn't be taken for granted and absolutely isn't unlimited. Russia has an acknowledged artillery shell production rate advantage compared to the European Union, for example, but they've also been using a lot more ammunition almost every day for more than 2.5 years at this point. They've lost ammunition in ammo depot explosions, arsenal explosions, and more ammo depot explosions. And we've also seen them issue some very, very old ammunition in some cases that you probably wouldn't want to load unless you either had no other choice or really keen to get that Looney Tunes barrel blowout look. One of the higher-end estimates for Russian artillery ammo production came out of Estonian military intelligence that suggests that a rate of somewhere between 4 and 4.5 million rounds per year. I believe that includes rounds that are being refurbished from older stocks. If those higher-end estimates for Russian ammo production and the South Korean figures around North Korean shell supply both hold true, then North Korea has supplied Russia with very roughly twice as many shells as Russia is able to turn out in a year. If we make some rough simplifying assumptions and throw it onto an indicative chart, you get what you see on screen now. Based on that implied rate of ramp-up, it would suggest that recently at least, North Korean ammunition has accounted for a majority of the shells that are coming into Russian inventory. And if you assume there's a 1-to-1 correlation between what's being supplied into the system and what rounds are being fired, not necessarily a safe assumption because there will always be stockpiles to draw from, not just new deliveries, you'd come to the rough conclusion that whatever rate of artillery fire Russia can currently sustain, it would only be about half that if the North Korean rounds didn't exist. In line with that calculation, The Times recently carried an article citing Western intelligence sources suggesting that indeed, about half of Russian shells used in Ukraine are supplied by North Korea. I'm not sure that's a perfectly safe assumption to make, but let's go with the ratio for the moment. If the Ukrainian figures are accurate, and the current Russian shell fire advantage is somewhere between 2 to 3 to 1 in their favour, halve that rate of fire, and suddenly you're talking about a conflict where Russia has somewhere between a 50% advantage and parity. And frankly, parity might not be good enough for an artillery-centric army that's primarily on the offense, using systems that are generally older, less accurate and less lethal than the ones being used by the Ukrainians. Forget North Korean troops assisting Russia with its offensive operations. At 6 to 8 million rounds supplied, North Korean armories would basically be underwriting the entire endeavour. And with South Korean Defence Intelligence apparently in the last couple of days upgrading that estimate to more than 9 million rounds, it's pretty hard to avoid the conclusion that Pyongyang has been absolutely essential in making sure that Russia has enough DACA to maintain the offensive. Now, to be fair, I think there's some evidence that math might be a bit too aggressive. There's a number of things we could go into, from observed fire patterns to what ammunition we've actually seen in the visual evidence, how much of the time. But one of the big ones here might simply be reliability and effectiveness. North Korea may supply lots and lots of artillery shells, but in at least some cases, they're reportedly only really artillery shells in the same way the Bob Semple is technically a tank. No offence meant, New Zealand, we know you were genuinely trying your hardest when you made this thing. The corrugated elements really give it a bit of character. Anyway, to quote from one relevant report, according to Ukrainian military officials, around half of all North Korean shells are defective, with most originating from the 1970s and 80s. A significant portion of these shells are non-functional, while the remainder require restoration or inspection prior to use. These assessments align with numerous reports from Russian soldiers. According to their accounts, North Korean shells frequently fail to reach their intended targets due to inconsistencies in the powder charges. The low quality of the powder results in shells being utilised in situations where accuracy, reliability, and even the successful exit of the projectile from the barrel are of minimal importance. End quote. Now, I'm not an artillery gunner, so I'm not sure what circumstances there could possibly be where the successful exit of the projectile from the bloody gun is considered an optional part of the procedure, but at the same time it seems more likely to me than not that those Ukrainian estimates around the failure rate probably aren't firm enough that we can take them for granted. Even if they are, though, it's pretty reasonable to argue that one North Korean shell is not worth the same as one newly built Russian shell. If we made a very rough assumption, for example, that in terms of overall effect, 2 North Korean shells have the same value as 1 Russian one, that would downgrade the overall value of the North Korean contribution to Russia's artillery firepower to being only equivalent to about 1 full year worth of Russian production. That's certainly a step back from reclassifying the Russian artillery as a proxy of Pyongyang, but it would still suggest that North Korean ammo shipments have had a massive impact on the overall balance of the artillery fight. Trying to convert counts of military equipment or munitions into some sort of universal measure, like US dollar value, is always going to be difficult and an imperfect exercise. But I think it might be worth having a bit of a go here just to give a sense of scale. One analysis of North Korea-Russia military cooperation assumed that of all the shells North Korea has sent Russia, roughly 75% are 152mm rounds and the remaining 25% 122mm. If we apply that ratio to the recent South Korean estimate of 8 million rounds being sent, that gives us 6 million 152mm shells and 2 million 122s. For the next step, we need a cost estimate per shell, or more realistically, a range of cost estimates. The chart you can see on screen here uses 3, all taken from a report by Olena Guseinova, who uses a low-end estimate of $300 for a 152mm shell and $150 for a 122, a medium-low estimate of $500 per 152 and $300 per 122, and a high-end estimate of $1,000 per 152 and $500 per 122. I've also added one additional one, $650 per 152mm shell and $625 per 122, which is what the report suggests that Russia likely paid Iran for older stockpiled ammunition in those 2 calibers. That would generate an estimated value just in artillery ammunition, not counting short-range ballistic missiles or any other types of equipment, of somewhere between 2.1 and 7 billion US dollars. And even then, I think in some respects the comparison is incomplete. Because even if there's a significant capability difference between a North Korean 152mm shell and a German-manufactured 155, if what we were concerned about is what it would take to equalise the rate of fire between the 2 sides, it's worth noting much of Ukraine's access is going to be to NATO calibers, not 152 and 122mm shells, priced at North Korean or Iranian levels. And with the immense inflation we've seen in the shell market since 2022, it's not unusual at this point for a European nation, for example, to pay north of $3,000 a shot for 155mm ammo. So if you wanted to match that North Korean shell supply, quantity for quantity, 155 for 152, ignoring the 122mm shells entirely and pricing those 155mm rounds at $3,000 per shot, you end up with a bill for a cool $18 billion. You could bolt together the annual UK and German budgets for military assistance to Ukraine, tack on Denmark, the Netherlands and several others, and at those prices you still wouldn't have an ammunition aid package large enough to match what the North Koreans have reportedly been able to send, shot for shot. Now yes, there is a significant cost and quality difference there. I would generally, for example, expect Rheinmetall-built artillery rounds to successfully leave the barrel when they're meant to. And if Ukraine were actually to receive 6 million 155mm rounds and 2 million 105mm rounds extra over the course of a year, I expect we'd be looking at some very different battlefield dynamics. But I think it's worth noting when an exercise like this places a country where much of the population doesn't have consistent access to electricity in the list of top arms suppliers for the war in Ukraine. But even if munitions might be the most impactful thing that North Korea has been sending to Russia so far, a lot of the attention has been on troops. And here, I think especially when we're trying to talk about what may or may not be an escalation, I think it's important to clarify what we mean when we say North Korea might be sending troops to help Russia for the first time. Because even before we started hearing larger estimates of 3,000 or 10,000 North Korean troops being sent into Russia, I think there's evidence to suggest that a much smaller number of North Korean personnel may have been in Russia for some time at this point. Logically speaking, there are some compelling reasons to think that might have been the case. You can imagine North Korean officers serving in an observation or attaché role, for example, reporting on lessons learned from the conflict and the performance of Dprk-supplied systems. And also, according to at least some reports, North Korean personnel may have been present in smaller numbers to serve in a technical advisory and observation role related to systems like the KN-23, perhaps helping Russia to operationalise the system and reporting back on how it performed. We also know that some North Korean personnel may already have become casualties, with the South Koreans reporting that it's highly likely that 6 KPA officers were killed in a Ukrainian missile strike near Donetsk on October 3rd. By themselves, though, these kind of smaller scale deployments may not have been considered as newsworthy as some of the stuff we've seen more recently. Some foreign personnel being present during this conflict isn't entirely unexpected, nor is it without precedent. Back in 2023, for example, the US announced it would be sending additional Americans to their embassy in Kyiv in order to monitor the aid that was being sent to Ukraine. Just having small numbers of personnel from either side present in monitoring or advisory roles probably isn't a significant escalatory step from a military perspective, although in the case of the DPRK, just about anything you might expect its troops to actually do in Russia besides breathing might be considered a breach of various UNSC resolutions. Instead, the escalatory jump here is probably about two things: a significant increase in quantity from dozens or hundreds of personnel to thousands or tens of thousands, and also potentially a change in role, from monitoring, support and advice to more direct combat involvement. Which brings us to the recent announcements and what we know or think we might know about the North Korean deployments. Now, as often seems to be the case with things like this, Russia's official response to these claims and revelations has been both forceful and also diverse. Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, reportedly described claims that North Korea was sending troops to assist them with their war in Ukraine as fake and exaggerated, and called on South Korean authorities to be prudent and sensible in their judgment, while at the same time saying that Russia would react harshly to any steps that threatened its own security, and suggested that Seoul could face security consequences if it became more involved in Ukraine. So basically, response one was, this is all fake news, and we might punish any country that claims this is happening or responds accordingly. Some other figures do appear to have deviated a bit from the ministry line, though, including such minor Russian political figures as President Vladimir Putin. After Putin was publicly asked by a reporter about satellite imagery that apparently showed North Korean troop movements into Russia, Putin's response was, quote, "Images are a serious thing. If there are images, then they reflect something," end quote. That's obviously a very different response from, this is all fake news, nothing to see here. So we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying fake news, Putin saying maybe, but it would be totally legit if we did it, and then there was Russian state TV, where we have sometimes seen panellists openly discussing how North Korean troops might be used and how useful they're likely to be. And Solovyov told his audience that North Korean troops in Russia would really be a case of Russia doing North Korea a favour, rather than vice versa, because it would be giving the North Koreans a chance to get combat experience. In terms of what more Ukraine-aligned sources are saying, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has indicated the US believes that North Korea has sent about 10,000 troops to Russia in total, first to training bases in the Far East, before the vast majority of them have been sent further west, closer to Ukraine. At time of recording, Blinken's most recent statements indicate the US believes that about 8,000 North Korean soldiers are now stationed relatively close to the Ukrainian front, predominantly in the Kursk region, and that Moscow is preparing to deploy those troops into combat relatively soon. Blinken also indicated that North Korean troops had received Russian training, quote, in artillery, UAVs, basic infantry operations, including trench clearing, indicating they fully intend to use these forces in frontline operations, end quote. We've also seen a number of videos come out appearing to show some North Korean presence in Russia, although here I'm going to sound a note of caution. Some of the footage we've seen appears to be relatively compelling, with some of the people in shot visibly speaking Korean with a North Korean dialect, but in other cases we've seen people take images of troops with Asian features in Russian military uniform and declare that these are North Koreans. It's important to remember that Russia is a very large country with significant ethnic minority populations, and so it takes a bit more than just physical appearance to positively identify troops as North Korean. And as at time of recording, I haven't seen any definitive visual evidence suggesting that North Korean troops are already in combat against Ukrainian forces. So at this stage, we're still primarily working with publicly released assessments and whatever makes it into open source. Perhaps the most comprehensive public assessments of North Korean troop deployments to Russia, however, have come from the ROK's National Intelligence Service. The most recent estimate I've seen from the South Korean NIS is that this wave of North Korean troops constitutes about 12,000 personnel of various types, from the higher end to the not-so-high end. For example, the South Koreans claim they've detected the first vice director of North Korea's munitions industry department, Kim Jong-sik, visiting a launch site for North Korean KN-23 missiles near the Russian-Ukrainian front lines several times, with accompanying North Korean officers to provide on-site guidance. They also indicate that 4 landing ships belonging to the Russian Pacific Fleet have already transferred approximately 1,500 North Korean Special Forces troops to Vladivostok, and that a second transport operation is expected to take place soon. I'd note that doesn't indicate, however, that many of the North Koreans sent haven't come from less flashy units. The South Koreans have released satellite imagery appearing to show concentrations of North Korean troops in Russia, and suggested that at least some of those North Korean units are likely to be deployed to the front lines as soon as they complete their adaptation training. Interestingly though, based on the video we've seen so far, and claims by some of these foreign intelligence services, it appears that the North Korean personnel that are being sent to Russia aren't generally being sent, at least based on what we've seen so far, in North Korean uniform or with North Korean equipment. Instead, the Ukrainians have indicated their belief, which appears to align with some of the video we've seen, that North Korean troops are being issued with Russian military uniforms, Russian small arms, Russian ATGMs, Russian mortars, the list goes on. Basically, from what we've seen so far, it looks like North Korea is basically just providing the personnel themselves and leaving all other costs related to the deployment, from equipment to transportation to feeding these guys, to their Russian hosts. And as for what Pyongyang is likely to get in return for doing so, the answer may just be cold hard cash. To quote from one AP report, Russia is expected to pay all costs related to the deployment of North Korean troops, including their wages, which observers estimate will be at least $2,000 per month for each person. About 90 to 95% of their stipends will likely go to Kim's coffers, and the rest to the soldiers. So basically, Pyongyang has gone into the military labour hire business, but using a business model where you're allowed to conscript your workers and then sell their labour to someone else while pocketing between 90 and 95% of the proceeds. There are some terms that come to mind for that kind of arrangement, none of which are particularly YouTube-friendly, but the sad reality is that for many North Korean soldiers, if they're able to keep even a few pennies on the dollar out of those sort of payments, it could still be a major financial deal for any that survive and are able to collect. Which naturally leads to the next question, I think, which is, how much difference might any of this actually make? And I think the best possible answer we can give at this point is a rather unsatisfying combination of yes, no, and it depends. In terms of how militarily effective we expect these North Korean troops to be, there's probably at least 2 main elements we need to look at. The first question is likely force quality and combat effectiveness. How good are these troops likely to be, and how effective are they likely to be in the Ukrainian context? Here there are obviously an enormous number of unknowns. We don't really have good data on the performance of North Korean units in large-scale combat operations since the early 1950s. And I seriously doubt that any of the North Korean troops that gained experience in that war will be making appearances in this one. That said, there's a couple of factors we might want to bundle together when predicting how these troops might perform in any particular role. The first is simply going to be the potential difficulty integrating these guys with the rest of the Russian forces, and particularly communicating. Your average North Korean is very much not going to speak Russian, and your average Russian officer is very much not going to speak Korean. Even if you have plenty of translators and good practice structures in place, having a force that doesn't speak the same language can still be a serious coordination issue.
Just check the Austro-Hungarian records to see how much fun that was.
There's also a question around mismatch in practices and training, and also whether or not North Korean training is actually applicable to the Ukrainian battlefield. These troops will have been trained to operate differently, to think differently, to fight differently than the Russian units they're presumably going to be cooperating with. And if, for example, they've been primarily trained to fight in the mountains of Korea against a force with overwhelming air superiority, that may not be immediately transferable to the very open battlefields of Ukraine, where the fire superiority picture is very much inverted. If for any reason a battle in Ukraine ultimately comes down to a question of which side is more capable of breaking bricks with their forehead or throwing hatchets while doing backflips, I am sure the North Koreans will prove to be the most effective troops in the country. But outside of that scenario, the quality of their training, their motivation, and their ability to coordinate with Russian forces are, I think, massive question marks. It is probably likely that most of the North Koreans will be much younger men than your average Ukrainian or Russian recruit at this point, but that's likely to be paired with its own unknowns, like nutrition, health, and motivation. The core point here is we can't be entirely sure what the quality of these North Korean forces is, at least not yet, but while they might potentially be useful in specialist roles if they have specialty skills, say if combat engineers were sent, for example, it seems more likely than not that in a combat situation, they'd be likely to underperform more experienced and capable Russian and Ukrainian units. And coming into all of this cold, with no experience fighting against FPV drones, for example, may be setting these North Korean troops up to learn some very quick, very costly lessons. And the second issue is simply quantity. Even if all of these troops were whatever passes for high-speed, low-drag operators in the North Korean Special Forces units, it's a really big ask for 8, 10 or 12,000 troops of any quality level to make a decisive impact in a war like this one. To put that into perspective, back in September, Putin authorised an increase in the strength of the Russian army by another 180,000 personnel. And in the last couple of days, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defence Council have said they need to draft a further 160,000. A number of Western sources have estimated that Russia's been recruiting on the order of 30,000 new troops every month. Members of the Russian government have tended to give us similar or even higher figures. In that respect, there's actually not much gap between what the Russian and Western governments are claiming. The Russian sources just tend to skip the explanation on what happens to them once they sign up, considering the official strength of the Russian military is increasing much, much slower than the claimed recruitment rate. But in any case, what that would seem to suggest is that 12,000 North Korean troops is really only equivalent to maybe 2 weeks of Russian recruitment activity. It's just mathematically very difficult for a contribution of this size to meaningfully shift the manpower balance of a war at this scale. Yes, it might be enough to improve the situation on one particular section of one particular front, say Kursk for example. It's just that 10,000 bodies don't go particularly far in a war of millions. Put those two elements together, questionable force quality and combat effectiveness, combined with a relatively small overall commitment, and I think the most reasonable conclusion to make at this point is that, in military terms, North Korean shells and North Korean missiles probably matter a lot more to Russia's combat power than the North Korean troops. But, as is often the case with my videos, there is an asterisk here, actually 2. The first is that even though this isn't something happening on a truly massive scale, it does set a precedent. And if you don't see a strong response from the opposing powers whenever a taboo like this one is broken, it can quickly become the new normal. And that might open the door to asterisk number 2, where North Korea ultimately decides to scale up its commitment. 10,000 troops may not be a game changer in Ukraine, but from North Korea's perspective, there may be a lot more where that came from. So if the political will on both sides is there, and the necessary resources are committed, it's not out of the question that Kim Jong-un would choose to send considerably more North Koreans to Russia, as long as Moscow's checks keep clearing. So a lot of what this ultimately means probably comes down to whether or not Russia and North Korea can be deterred from scaling up this kind of arrangement. So if this is happening, and at this point it looks very much like it is, what options might Ukraine's various allies and supporters have to respond? And from that available toolkit, what might they be willing to do given the current political environment? One option that was very quickly brought up, which might seem intuitive, is punishing North Korea for sending these troops. The traditional formulation would be to announce additional sanctions against North Korea or North Korean officials in order to, in the best case scenario, force them to reevaluate their life choices and decide to bring the troops home, and if not, at least establish some semblance of deterrence by punishment to discourage them from sending additional troops or engaging in any other form of escalation. Sanctions are a pretty commonly used tool in the US and allied nation foreign policy toolkit, but in this case, they might be about as effective as trying to chew through tank armour using a nail file.
There are several problems with trying to coerce North Korea using sanctions. The first is just about everything you care about is probably already sanctioned, except perhaps for food aid, but that's probably not an acceptable target, either ethically or politically, and even if it was, you'd have to assume that Pyongyang would be willing to cave on a policy question in order to avoid its people starving, which historically is not exactly a safe bet. You also have to assume that no other power, like Russia or China, might step in to fill the gap. And that leads to issue number 2, sanctions enforcement, and who has to enforce them. The DPRK's primary trade partners are the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. And I think it's fair to say that I am more likely to win an Olympic gold medal in figure skating than Russia is to enforce Western sanctions on North Korea because North Korea helped Russia. Realistically, at this point, the only coercive pressure the United States or its allies can apply against Pyongyang is either going to be indirect, by convincing North Korea's various allies to change their policies, or it's going to be something that affects security, specifically the security of something that Kim Jong-un is actually likely to care about, like Kim Jong-un or the Kim government. There being very little apparent appetite to escalate on the Korean Peninsula at the moment, it may be that any new sanctions we see against North Korea are more likely to be symbolic than decisively effective. Many of the response options available to policymakers that might be more effective then are probably less likely to target North Korea and more likely to directly or indirectly target Russia. Here, perhaps the most impactful potential change would be a policy shift in Seoul. In particular, a change in the policy that so far prevented Seoul directly sending lethal military aid to Ukraine and even placed considerable restrictions on what it's willing to send to third parties in order to support Ukrainian resupply efforts. You can imagine all sorts of logical cases being made for that kind of move. Seoul, for example, has so far been relatively cautious about its efforts to support Ukraine, and it appears to have been so in part to discourage Russia from deepening its engagement with North Korea. That carrot has now very clearly and very publicly failed. So, the logic may go, it might be time for a bit of stick, and the ROK has some very big sticks. It's important to understand here that even within the scope of a very conservative policy by Seoul, the ROK's arms and munitions stockpiles and productive potential are so great that what South Korea might consider to be relatively small actions can have massive impacts compared to what other nations can accomplish. In 2023, for example, the ROK sent hundreds of thousands of artillery shells to the United States so that US rounds could be sent to Ukraine. They've also been speed delivering new armoured vehicles and all kinds of munitions to Poland so that Poland can feel confident giving away its inventory. And there is an enormous amount of material the ROK could potentially supply to Ukraine, especially in a scenario where the North is increasingly sending more and more of its ammunition to Russia, thus presumably diminishing its own readiness in Korea. The ROK produces small arms and ammunition, sub-munitions for drones, cluster artillery rounds. There's a ground-launched ATACMS equivalent available in very small numbers, and stocks of old unguided munitions, like 105mm artillery rounds, available in very large numbers. The list of potentially useful equipment goes on, including a lot of older equipment kept in reserve, and even a small fleet of Russian T-80 main battle tanks that the country basically received as a form of barter payment when things weren't doing too well in Russia. The basic takeaway here is that no matter how unreliable the munitions in question might be, North Korea has likely succeeded in shifting the munitions availability balance further in favour of Russia. And the ROK is one of the few countries out there other than the United States that has the inventories you might need to shift it decisively the other way. Along with the likes of Greece and Turkey, South Korea is one of the nations in the broader US alliance structure where politics and strategy are probably greater barriers to supplying Ukraine than the limits of their inventory. Changing the rules around arms supply is something that only Seoul can do, but a different option available to almost all of Ukraine's allies and supporters would be some kind of symmetrical escalation. One where basically the response to North Korea sending troops to assist Russia would be to send allied troops to assist Ukraine. This is an idea that's been floated repeatedly in the past and just as repeatedly shot down, but there is an immense amount Ukraine could potentially get out of this kind of assistance. Yes, Ukraine needs more of basically everything at this point, and more manpower is always valuable, but the real value add that's also likely to be far more politically acceptable than the alternative is allied personnel focused on non-combat roles. Think maintainers to help support the dozens of different NATO-type systems that have been supplied at this point, and which Pavel and his mates are dutifully trying to keep running, using translated manuals, Google searches, the occasional tech support phone call, and a no doubt non-zero amount of very manual non-compliant welding, and the occasional bit of percussive maintenance. Whatever it takes to rouse the machine spirits to action.
There's a laundry list of other skills that could potentially be useful, from logisticians to trainers, to very long training lead time roles like fighter pilots and aircraft maintainers. The potential escalatory impact of sending significant numbers of personnel from NATO countries into Ukraine has always been a bit muddled if you look at the narrative from the Russian government. On one hand, we have Putin and a variety of Russian government figures making statements on the record that tend to group around the suggestion that if one or more NATO states were to send military personnel to Ukraine, that would be a major escalatory step and bring the world closer to nuclear war. So yeah, if NATO sends troops, it'll be a massive deal, World War III will be on, and we'll be one step away from those silos popping open. But also at the same time, according to Russian government figures and Russian state media, NATO is already sending troops to Ukraine, has for some while, and that's part of the reason the Russian military has been struggling the way it has. Earlier this year, General Sergei Rudskoy was quoted in Russian state media saying the following: NATO military personnel, under the guise of mercenaries, participate in hostilities. They control air defence systems, tactical missiles, and multiple launch rocket systems, and are part of assault detachments. End quote. In one of his recent threats, warning NATO states not to authorise Ukraine to use Western-built munitions against internationally recognised Russian territory, one of Putin's arguments as to why that would apparently constitute the direct involvement of NATO in the conflict is that the usage of those weapons would apparently not be possible without the assistance of NATO personnel on the ground, programming the missiles and providing the necessary data. Which, given those missiles are already in use against targets in places like Crimea, which Russia claims to be its own territory, implies that either NATO personnel are already in Ukraine assisting in the usage of long-range weapons against Russian territory, or that apparently the Ukrainians can figure out the GPS coordinates for Sevastopol, but not Belgorod. Oh, and let's not forget the occasional online tabloid or social media story, for example, this one by Pravda, that ran the not particularly ambiguous headline, "Dozens more NATO officer bodies remain under rubble after Russian strike, hundreds of corpses under rubble, details of Russian retaliatory strike on NATO command centre." Basically, when you're talking about Russian information warfare efforts, it can feel like that when you're talking about the risk of escalation, then sending NATO or allied personnel into Ukraine would be an incredibly dangerous and escalatory step that would probably result in mutual atomic annihilation. But if you're trying to explain why the Russian military hasn't already defeated Ukraine, or why Russia feels justified enlisting assistance from countries like North Korea or Iran, then NATO troops in Ukraine is suddenly something that happens all the time, has been happening since the beginning, and the Ukrainian army is presumably only a step or two away from just being a NATO army, disguised with a yellow and blue colour patch. I'd say this was a case of Schrodinger's NATO generals, but in this case, apparently the uncertainty persists even after you look inside the metaphorical box and blow up the literal bunker. I bring this up not just to highlight the cognitive dissonance and often self-contradictory nature of the messaging that Russia puts out. That really is nothing new, and you see it on multiple points of analysis all the time. The point is not that the arguments are mutually contradictory, that's probably a feature, not a bug of the system. The point is, it might be somewhat more difficult to predict how Russia would actually respond or choose to counter-escalate if NATO or allied countries started to actually do something they have long accused them of doing. We've also seen Ukraine recently open the door a little wider to another method of getting foreign personnel involved, opening up the option for foreigners to serve as officers in Ukraine's international formations. And there's a couple of impacts that sort of change might have. First, at least at certain organisational levels, it might allow foreigners to lead foreigners. It may also allow foreigners who've already proven themselves in Ukraine to receive commissions. And thirdly, it might open the door a little wider to certain specialist positions that usually come with an officer's rank. Pilots, for example, are almost universally commissioned officers. Another option for Ukraine supporters would be a form of retaliation against Russia, but not a retaliation in kind. If there isn't an appetite there to counter-escalate North Korean troops with allied troops, another option would be to find a more politically acceptable target that still inflicts damage on the Russian Federation and go straight for that. At the moment, there are still plenty of cards nations could play to go after either the Russian economy or the Russian military. The Russian economy, for its part, has hit a couple of very public bumps recently. The country's benchmark interest rate has been increased again to 21%, with further increases possible in the future. They've reportedly had significant issues selling bonds despite offering quite high yields. And perhaps the country's most powerful economic institutions, the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of Russia, appear to be acting vaguely like overdramatic high school students who will only communicate with each other through a third party.
Reportedly, at least one figure at the Russian central bank claimed that they found out about 2025 budget outcomes through the media, while Russia's finance minister has reportedly said the 2025 budget was designed assuming an interest rate of 15.1%, despite the central bank setting a higher rate and warning it would continue to do so. Basically, the Ministry of Finance appears to be spending ever greater amounts of money to try and speed up the Russian war economy, while the central bank continues to raise interest rates in a desperate attempt to slow it down. Against that backdrop of a labour shortage, high inflation, sky-high interest rates, but also sky-high military demands, there are probably opportunities for other countries to get a couple of additional economic body blows in, should they choose to do so. Militarily relevant escalation options also obviously remain on the table, things like authorising long-range strikes into internationally recognised Russian territory using supplied weapon systems. But given we've talked about that policy question extensively in the past, I won't go over it again here. The key point here is that if decision makers want to respond to this particular North Korean step, they have a lot of tools in the kit to do so. And yet, so far, the response we have seen has been incredibly muted. For example, the US recently made an announcement, making clear that in response to the Dprk flaunting various UNSC resolutions and potentially openly joining the fight in Ukraine, the United States would be responding by not imposing additional restrictions on the usage of weapons by Ukraine. And no, I didn't misspeak there. They didn't say they'd be removing restrictions on the usage of weapons by Ukraine. They just said they wouldn't be imposing new additional ones in response to the North Koreans arriving. Now, if you want to adopt a very generous interpretation, you could suggest that all the United States is really doing there is clarifying that Ukraine can use its current systems against North Korean troops in the same ways and under the same circumstances that it could use them against Russian troops. They don't want Kyiv, for example, putting an ATACMS on a cargo ship, floating it halfway around the world, and then flinging a missile at Pyongyang. But in terms of what that actually does to help Ukraine respond to the arrival of North Korean troops, the answer is not much. Essentially, at this point, at least publicly, the response by most of the relevant actors has simply been to vacillate. And if I was a betting man, I'd put money down on many of them continuing to vacillate until perhaps the second week of November. Because for all of the violent intensity of Russia's recent offensive operations, I'd argue that one of the most decisive contests of the war in Ukraine and the global security environment more broadly is currently playing out not in Ukraine but in the United States. Because this episode has the dubious honour of being recorded during the closing days of the US presidential election campaign. As a general rule, I don't like to harp on US domestic politics, and I imagine many of the Americans in the audience are probably tired enough of the election interference that already does happen, without an Aussie YouTuber deciding to get in on the action. But if you're trying to assess the trajectory of the war in Ukraine and the likely responses to these recent Russian and North Korean moves, there are a few things that have to be said about the United States and its critical role. At its strategic core, the US is perhaps the world's most significant security exporter. On one hand, that means American strategists can often quite reasonably argue that mathematically, many of its allies have historically been able to underspend on defence, relying on the United States to make up the security deficit. But on the other hand, it means the United States exercises a pretty significant degree of control over the strategic direction and actions of a broader military alliance structure that collectively is far stronger than the United States alone. Basically, if you're significantly reliant on the United States for your national security, it might be somewhat more difficult to say no if the US says it's time to buy some more American weapons, sanction somebody, or join them in another military campaign that can only ever end well. This can create a kind of US military power feedback loop. The more allies and infrastructure the US has access to, the greater its ability to project power around the world, thus the more valuable it becomes as an ally and security provider, thus causing it to have access to more allies, more bases, and a greater ability to project power. It also means that US policy may not determine allied policy, but it can certainly influence it. If you're currently a country in NATO or one of the broader alliance structures, you're probably keenly aware that at this moment, the United States is deciding between two potential future administrations, which appear to have very different policy positions when it comes to Russia and the war in Ukraine. Kamala Harris has publicly called for the continuation of support to Ukraine, although it still seems likely that her team would likely deviate from the decisions made by the Biden White House, at least in some respects. But there appear to be fairly wide gaps between her stated positions and some of the others being put forward in the campaign. JD Vance, for example, has reportedly suggested that a future peace settlement in Ukraine might involve Russia remaining in occupation of the territory it's taken, a demilitarised zone being established, and a neutral Ukraine, so one that doesn't benefit from NATO security guarantees, having to rely on a fortified front line to deter a future Russian invasion. One question that might be asked there is how Ukraine is expected to maintain a military strong enough to deter a rebuilding Russian armed forces without significant foreign military and financial assistance. And if it were to receive that sort of financial and military assistance, why that would be cheaper than alternatives like security guarantees or even really represent neutrality in the first place. But the core point here isn't the viability of the two policy sets, it's how different they are. So if you're a US ally waiting to make a major security policy decision right now, it probably makes sense for you to wait, and wait, and wait, until you know what kind of White House you're likely to be dealing with from 2025 to 2028. Now, of course, European states that may want to break with future US policy on Ukraine can, of course, develop and put in place contingency plans. Some of those have probably already been prepared. And there arguably are some areas of Ukraine-Russia policy where EU states are the leading actors. The vast majority of frozen Russian assets, for example, aren't frozen in the United States, they're in Europe. But it's important to recall that while there is a lot that European and other states can potentially do, there are a lot of policy levers a future US administration could potentially choose to pull if they wanted to pressure countries into greater policy alignment. For example, if you're talking about the dynamics of arms supply, you may eventually run into ITAR, the US International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And between ITAR and the terms of various agreements the US tends to enter into when it supplies arms to foreign powers, there are a lot of things the US can potentially put the brakes on. US-manufactured weapons, for example, cannot be shipped without US permission. Weapons built in other countries but featuring US components often cannot be shipped without US permission. And in some cases, foreign-designed weapons built primarily using foreign components but reliant on US data or US software cannot be shipped or used without US permission. And so while there may be scope for Europe to display a degree of strategic autonomy when it comes to Ukraine policy, Washington is often going to have at least some power to incentivise or disincentivise particular choices. If we look at the current Russian strategy in Ukraine and the way we've seen it play out over the course of 2023 and 2024, I think one possibility is that the Russian leadership, and Putin in particular, have chosen to make a massive strategic bet. We know pretty definitively that despite Russia's massive resources, the war in Ukraine, as it's currently being fought, is not sustainable for Russia. The regenerative capacity of the Russian military is still overwhelmingly based on the reactivation of old equipment, the stockpiles of which we can see steadily running down, all while the Russian central bank openly discusses the pain and challenges facing the economy, while the CEO of Rostec, Sergei Chemezov, is openly talking about the fact that the interest rates that are necessary to hold down inflation in Russia are also making it basically impossible for many of the defence companies to operate. And as he put it, quote, simply, if we continue to work like this, then the majority of our enterprises will go bankrupt, end quote. Russia isn't about to collapse tomorrow, but it also can't go on like this forever. The strategic bet then seems to be that even if Russia can't go on forever, it can go on long enough for the West to blink first. And in that sense, I'd hazard to suggest that some of the points I made back in March 2022 remain relevant to the war in November 2024. That the balance of the war remains closer than it might have appeared in January 2022, and if the West wants Ukraine to grind down the Russian military or push Russia to the negotiating table, it has the resources necessary to do so. The decisive question was whether the policy decisions and political will were going to be there to do so. At the time, I suggested that what that might require would be convincing Moscow that support for Ukraine would be so extensive, so enduring, and so reliable that Moscow would come to believe that they wouldn't be able to outlast the West, nor secure better outcomes by carrying on or escalating the war, as opposed to coming to the table. To date, that hasn't happened, and it remains deeply uncertain whether it will happen in the future. And so for the moment, countries like North Korea might believe that they can take escalatory steps, like sending in the troops, while just about everyone, from decision-makers in European capitals to Moscow and Pyongyang, to soldiers in frontline Ukrainian trenches, look to the United States and wait, at least until next week. See you then.